lion's embroidered cuff, and of the way the poet's line about red returning as memory had sounded less like metaphor and more like instruction. Color did not only decorate, it summoned. The next morning the market's clatter felt closer to the palace than it had in months. Mei Lin wrapped in a plain cloak and walked along the outer lane beneath the palace wall. The market made a muted chorus, the barter of fish and sacks of rice, a child's tantrum, the creak of a cart. She found Chen where she knew he would sit in the shadow of a stall that sold crushed minerals layered in small ceramic bowls. He had a kerchief at his brow and a stoop like a man who had bent too often to pick things up. Chen's face broke into too bright courtesy when she approached. "Painter from the North Court," he said. "What trouble brings you to my dust?" Mei Lin smiled with the flatness of a coin. "Small trouble," she said. She did not name paper and scrolls or the risk of this particular trade. She only placed a small coin on the stall and tapped at a bowl of blue dust. The vendor's fingers were stained. He pinched a half-pinch of mineral and set it on a scrap of paper. "Not much," he murmured. "From the south. The boats bring less every month. Trouble with the sea and trouble with men." They bartered in silence that felt heavier than any spoken agreement, the kind of silence traded between people who keep one another alive by not airing the worst of things. Chen's eyes flicked to her hands and then away. "You must be quiet," he said. "There are ears here that like to hear rumor and sell it a voice." Mei Lin nodded. She took the dust, wrapped it in a scrap of silk, and folded it into the lining of her sleeve. The touch of the mineral against her palm made a map. The tiny vesicles of different blue, the way it shifted with a tilt. The suggestion of a green undertone that would respond to rice fermentation like a slow tide. She paid Chen in a way that said more than money. She left him a promise in her eyes that she would not betray his source. In return, he taught her a small parry, how to dust a seam of pigment on clothes so it would not appear in inspections. A practical trick of concealment that felt like a betrayal and a kindness in the same breath. When she returned to the studio, the teacup waited, innocuous and patient. She uncorked her vial, added the newly bought grit to the residual ferment, and stirred until the color deepened from shy blue to a marine confidence. She tested again, this time on the underside of the cup, where it would not be seen easily. The color dried with the slow certainty of an answered question. She lifted the teacup to the light and watched the thin rim. It was a small thing, only a line, but to her it felt like a thread tugging at a curtain. In the afternoon, as servants moved like small white moths through the palace, a junior official remarked on the teacup's line when he came to borrow a cloth. He took it in his hands, drank the tea, and suddenly chuckled. "This is the blue my father liked," he said. He would press his thumb to the rim and tell us the sea had found us again. The phrase traveled across the courtyard like a bird on a breeze. By dusk someone else had seen the color and associated it with a line of an old poem. It was not an explosion, not yet, but it rippled. At night Mei Lin closed the cedar box, placed the teacup inside, and wrote a new line in the journal she kept of colors. She labeled the blue with the fragment's strange characters, and then beneath them wrote, in her own hand, a translation that could be trusted to memory. Southern Tide Blue Rice Ferment Lime Wash Sun Cure. She sealed the page with a small stamp of cinnabar, not to mark the recipe, but to remind herself. Keep the color's life sacred and keep those who tend it even more so. Word would come. The first whisper always did. In the pale hours before the palace awoke, Mei Lin listened for the sound and found instead a new note rising within herself, a cautious hope. To coax color from stone had always meant to repair something broken. If she coaxed it now, could she stitch a memory back into a sovereign? Could a line of blue on a cup become a rope strong enough to pull an empire toward recognition? The question sat like a pebble in her mouth. She swallowed it, tasted salt and rice and the faint metallic tang of ore. The legal edicts that had stripped the southern ateliers of their craft were not far away in either thought or consequence. But memories, she thought, were their own kind of law. In the palace where names unraveled and days folded into one another, a small, stubborn color might be the only thing that could remind a man of who he had once been. Outside, beyond the palace walls, the sea sighed as it always had. Mei Lin imagined her grandmother on some distant shore, listening to gulls and hammering a stone with the rhythm of a song. The inheritance of hands was not a piece of parchment. It was a manner of touching the world until it replied. If color could make a man speak a name, then perhaps it could make an empire remember who it was. If it could do that, there would be those who would protect it, and those who would kill to control it. She put her hand on the cedar box and held the teacup like a small living thing. The palace slept and the moon marked silver across the roofs. Mei Lin inhaled once, the way one inhales before undertaking a long measure, and then began to plan the next experiment. The blue glowed in her mind like a promise, and with promise came danger. She could already hear the first soft notes of rumor gather into louder sound. Someone at the studio had made a color again. When the rumor reached the eunuch who had first warned her of the emperor's fading memory, he only shrugged and said in a tight voice, "Colors have a way of finding ears that will shout." But Mei Lin felt the opposite. Colors found small hands, hands found other hands, and before long the world had a hue to argue over. She laced the cedar box shut and slid the key beneath a floorboard. Outside, a gull cried once, a thin long note that sounded in her ear like a bell rung for remembered names. It was the smallest possible miracle. Its consequence would be far larger than she imagined. Mei Lin walked into the neighborhood with memory like a map folded into her palm. The palace lay behind her in a blur of lacquered gates and exhausted banners. Ahead, the city's edge smelled of brine and kiln smoke and a poverty that did not pretend to ceremony. She kept the scrap of southern silk folded in a lining of her robe, a narrow, dangerous secret pressed against her ribs. The fragment felt almost trivial in daylight, a smudge of blue and a few letters in a hand she could not read. At dusk, folded into the patient gray of the sky, the color on the cloth seemed to glow like a private summons. The lane that led to Jiao's workshop had once been a thoroughfare for carts heavy with fired tiles and glazed fish pots. Now puddles of brackish water caught the reflections of chimneys, and men bent over low fires to patch brittle clogs. Tiles littered the thresholds like the bones of old roofs. Mei Lin kept her steps small, letting the rhythm of the place settle inside her. She had been taught to move like a brushstroke, economical, deliberate, an absence of flourish. Such smallness protected her in the palace, and for once it felt useful in the city's fringe. The workshop itself sat behind a low wall of blackened brick, a narrow door patched with spare wood. A faded paper talisman, its characters half-eaten by smoke, flapped in the wind. Inside was the color of old bone, a dim amber from a single high lantern, and the gray of ashes. The smell was immediate: vinegar, iron, burnt rice, and salt, and it made the back of her throat tighten in remembrance of long afternoons at her grandmother's coastal kitchen, where pigments had once been laughter and work, not crime. Jiao did not rise to meet her. He was a man folded into his bench, shoulders curved like a spent kiln. His hands, long and stained with a dozen winters of mineral dust, turned over a small stone pestle as if testing its weight. When he looked up, his eyes were the color of river pebbles, dull at first, then catching light at unexpected moments. "You come from the palace, then," he said without greeting. The words had the flat politeness of one who asked the facts of life and let them land. Mei Lin set the scrap between them on the bench and smoothed the rag like a conciliatory offering. "I am Mei Lin," she said. "I paint in the inner court." She balked for a second, aware of how little an office title meant here, how little it would convince a man who had been in exile from the very thing she sought. "I found this." She tapped the blue smudge with one cautious fingertip. Jiao only watched. Then, with the economy of someone who trusted evidence more than pleadings, he unwrapped the scrap and held it to the lantern. Up close, the mineral mark on the silk was not merely ink. It had the way a color nested itself into thread, a depth that meant it had been mixed into the very fiber rather than merely laid upon it. Jiao's thumb brushed the edge of the smear and came away with a faint film of azure. He set the piece down carefully, as if setting alive things among dead. Southern, he said finally, a single word delivered like a verdict. The name unspooled other things in Mei Lin's chest, the ruined ateliers, the political edicts that had followed fire and accusation. The long years when Southern dyes were banned and their names buried in official scrolls. She had heard rumors in the palace corridors. She had dreamed recipes in the tilt of candlelight, but to hear the syllable leave Jiao's lips felt like the unlock of a heavy door. Jiao's hands moved with the same surety she had seen in Master's hands in court, a motion honed by repetition. He unlaced a small jar from a peg and produced a sliver of glass wrapped in oilcloth. "If it is what I think, it will not sing on ordinary mordant," he said. "It asks for a tempering of sea and starch and patience. It is not forgiving." His voice was not unkind, but it carried an economy to an apprenticeship might be given, but it would be costly. They began to work. The first lessons were almost ritual, the careful selection of a stone, the patter of rainwater into a bowl to serve as distilled solvent, the soft, patient circling of pestle upon flat stone. Jiao taught her to listen, about how a pigment did not announce itself in a single phrase, but in a chorus of tiny clues. The sound of a dry powder under a pestle told of its crystalline edges. The smell that rose when an ore met quicklime spoke of sulfides and of iron. The way a suspension pooled on a porcelain dish said something about its oil affinity. "You need to learn to hear what it will do," Jiao said once, as if the lesson were moral rather than technical. His thumb brushed an arc on the mortar and left a blue crescent like a moon. A pigment is a stubborn animal. You coax it, you do not demand it. Mei Lin had spent years listening to color, in other ways how a wash made a face breathe, how a scar on parchment could be confessed through a carefully chosen vermilion. But this was a different register, materials that remembered the earth where they had been cut, salts that carried the sea's mouth inside them, the ghost of fermentation. He set a sliver of the suspected mineral on white porcelain and tilted a droplet of rainwater into it. Nothing happened. He added a teaspoon of rice washing thin and sticky and the mineral merely dulled. "Not yet," Jiao murmured. He uncapped a small bottle of a dark liquid and added a hair of it to the dish. A faint sheen rose, a film that was not immediately color but a promise. He coaxed. He tapped his pestle in small circles until the granules lay like ground stars. Then, with a motion that was almost shy, he took a fingertip and rubbed the edge of the ground powder across the back of his hand. The blue came up like a memory, not a bright, garish streak, but a depth that ate the gray light and held heat. It stained the fine ridges of his skin and made the lines of his palm sing. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Gio knocked the ash off the stone and sat back. "It is southern," he said again. This time there was a note in his voice that made Mei Lin's chest ache, recognition mixed with something like grief, not cobalt but a complex tincture. They used fixative seaweed, fermented bean, bone ash in ratios so delicate a child might weep over them. Once you know the song, you can follow it. Once you shout the wrong chorus, the color runs like blood on cloth. Mei Lin thought of the scrap single smear and all the thin histories it carried, fields gouged for ore, boats that had sailed with sacks of pigment, workshops where women's hands sang recipes into the night. The court taught history as lines of mandate and lists of victories. At the edges of those lines lay human things, women who nurtured pigments like children, miners who cracked their knuckles to pry color from stone, families who fermented and boiled and died into the small hours. Mei Lin felt, with a painful clarity, that learning this craft was less like acquiring a tool and more like inheriting a ledger that had accounts to settle. The technical lessons blurred into long afternoons. Jiao taught her tempering, the careful burnishing of mineral into a stable colloid, the precise addition of an alkaline compound that would prevent the blue from leaching when the work met the humidity of a palace room. He insisted she learn to grind until the powder sang a particular pitch under the pestle. He taught her the humbling labor of mordanting steeping cloth in a tannin bath fashioned from oak galls or from boiled tea, then rinsing and testing. And always, always, he said the same small parable: the pigment remembers the hand that asked for it. If the asking is greedy, the color hides. If the asking is careful, the color stays. Mei Lin's hands learned new muscles. Where court painting had been rapid preparing scrolls for quick ceremony, touching a face with a stroke that would be admired, and then rolled and boxed, this new practice required a patient muscle memory. She spent 3 mornings making mordant, measuring out the burnt sugar Jiao swore by. She watched, under his supervision, as a piece of muslin took on the faintest aquamarine when steeped in a bath of seaweed and slaked lime. On the 4th day, after much coaxing, a small circle of blue, like a held breath, appeared on a test slip. Between the two of them, hands trembling with the shock of success, they laughed softly as if the sound were a vow. Jiao did not offer equal joy. The man's life had been braided with loss. As he ground, he told them, in fragments that felt like stone thrown into still water, of the purge years, of furnaces smashed by men with axes, of workshops locked and burned, of artisans dragged off in the night as state men sought evidence to justify a campaign. He spoke of a southern town where he had once stood and watched miners dig a vein of azure so rich the whole village was stained by market day. He spoke of an order that had called the color heterodoxy, and of how, in the space of a moon's turning, the village had been emptied. I carried recipes in my mouth for years, he said, and Mei Lin realized he meant it literally, the way some people put phrases inside their bodies to keep them safe. I thought I could hide from history. I thought the earth's hunger would forgive me if I kept quiet. But nothing forgives without looking for it. The men who take color for banners do not ask whose hands bore it. They only ask if it will make people look and follow. I have paid for that ignorance. His fingers traced a line on the mortar as if tracing a name. There was a pause, and Mei Lin wanted to reach across the bench and touch his arm in the way she had once touched the edge of a painting to steady a trembling hand. She loved people through edges and pigments. To learn was to forge a soft kind of love. She also recognized that her hunger for color had the brightness of a blade. The risk in wanting to resurrect something forbidden wore itself into her like a slow abrasion. "If you teach me," she said finally, "I will not let others be hurt. I will guard it the way my grandmother taught me, with songs and knots and names only we know." It was the truth. She would do anything for the colors, and she believed in the ethics of her cause. But the world was larger and more hungry than either of them. Jiao considered her with the same weathered patience with which he tempered pigments. "You must understand that this knowledge does not belong to any one heart," he said. "A pigment carries the country in it. To paint is to speak aloud what the empire would rather forget. If you take it into the palace, it will not stay private. People will ask questions. Men like Shen will not see memory as medicine. They will see it as a threat." He pushed a small wooden box across the bench. Inside lay a slip of paper folded like a tiny talisman. On it, in a hand that might once have been taught by scholars but grown into something like a miner's scrawl, were ratios and names: see rice 1, 8, lime ash, simmer low, ferment 3 nights. Mei Lin swallowed and read. The numbers were more than numbers, a language of alchemy. She closed the box and held the paper like a relic. For a moment she was back in her grandmother's kitchen, where women boiled dyes and sang while their hands rushed the stone. The smell of boiling rice was suddenly a bell in her memory. "Will you teach me?" she asked. "I will show you how it moves," Jiao said. "And I will show you what it means when it fails. You will learn the craft, and you will learn the account books that come with it." When a color is born, someone paid in labor, in land, in the digging of a body of shore. You will keep that ledger in your head as well as your hands. If you cannot carry that, then you cannot paint beyond the private. His voice softened at the end. And if you must spread it, you must be honest with whom you spread it to. No lies, Mei Lin. No small betrayals for glory. Such terms suited her more than flattery. The palace taught her the language of courtesies and small inventions. Jia's terms taught a hard, moral grammar. She accepted without ceremony. I will learn, as you say, she answered. I will not seek fame. I will keep the names we must keep. They arranged times. The lessons would be at midday, when the market's noise quieted, and at night, when the kiln fires cooled and the city's copper breath slowed. Mei Lin came wrapped in simple garments and left her palace titles at the threshold. She swept Jia's floors with a broom, ground ore until her knuckles ached, fetched rainwater for rinsing, and labored until the small blue test slips multiplied like a new kind of scripture. Each slip was a litany, each smear a prayer. Once, while stirring a vat that smelled like kelp and old wine, she asked a question that had gnawed at her in the long hours. Why hide? Why did the court burn the southern houses? What danger was the color? Jia's hands stilled. He pointed to the narrow window where smoke threaded the sky. Color is a tension made visible, he said. An image can call people to remember something that leaders would rather be subdued. When banners show vivid faces of what was lost, people ask how and why those faces are gone. Those questions are hard. Leaders like to keep the world manageable: lines, lists, order. Color makes the edges bleed. It complicates. Once the world is complicated, you must answer. Men who fear answers will burn the books instead. Mei Lin thought of the palace and its careful order, measured ceremonies that made decay look dignified. Ministers whose faces grew paler each season as if their own blood were being rationed into saves. She thought of the emperor at prayer, of Consort Lion's faint smile that sometimes showed memory like a small jewel. She thought of how a painted bird on a scroll could conjure a poem from a mind that otherwise wandered. The city slid into night around them. Through the thin wall she could hear a porter's song and the distant rattle of a cart. Jiao packed away the day's pigments into small jars lined with oilcloth. He wrapped the jars with care, then took one and placed it in Mei Lin's hands. Not for sale, he said. Not for galleries, not for shows. For the emperor, perhaps. For memory, perhaps. But never for the banners of men who will sell what is not theirs to sell. Mei Lin held the jar like a promise and felt the weight of its danger. She had crossed a threshold. The pigments were not merely color. They were a means of reconnection, a language to call names back from the fog. They also carried the history of extraction and death, of villages emptied and rivers dimmed. She left the workshop with the jar wrapped tight inside her robe, with a list of stages for tempering ink committed to memory, and with the knowledge that to learn was to assume a ledger that might one day demand repayment. As she retraced her steps to the palace, the city behind her exhaled the day's last heat. Men leaned at doorways and children chased each other in the alley's narrowing light. For a time her thoughts were small and practical: how to hide the jar in a court where searches were common, how to place a single brushstroke without raising suspicion. Then a larger, sharp thought cut through them. If color could recall a single name to an embering mind, what else might it recall? The possibility made her chest ache with both greed and dread. At the gate to the inner city she paused and, for a moment, let the silk of the palace hang in her hands like a costume she no longer felt comfortable in. The lanterns in the palace looked like moons trapped behind high walls. Somewhere inside, men in black robes, bodies trained to prefer the crispness of order, continued their counting of days and decrees. Outside, a man named Jiao had given her tools that might be used to unmake or remake memory. She tucked the jar deeper into her robe and folded the memory of the day into her chest like a pressed flower. Her journal, small, leather-bound, and full of swatches, waited on her person. She pulled it out and, by the light that leaked from a street lantern, drew the first careful sketch of the stone mortar and the crescent blue stain it had left on Gia's palm. The sketch was clumsy, but it held the curve of the man's hand and the way the blue had seemed to glow from within his skin. Then, as if the world wished to remind her of the price of all things beautiful, a troop of city patrols moved down the lane with a rattle that made the dog shy. Men in plain black shifted and took up position at intervals like crows settling on a wire. Mei Lin's pulse quickened. She made herself small, pulled her hood low, and walked the last stretch to the palace door. The guards, mostly bored, only glanced. But in her chest she could feel the old ledger opening. Zhao had taught her how to make color sing. The next lessons, she knew, would be about who had the right to hear the song. The palace woke each morning with the sound of things being hushed. Not with the theatrics of hands and tongues, but with a smaller, stranger silence, lacquer lids lifted and set down without a scrap of sound. Curtains drawn with the carefulness of people who no longer trusted the world to hold on to brightness. In the great halls the banners hung like tired sails. Once they had offered a pageant of vermilion and deep lapis to steady a ruler's face and temper revolts with spectacle. Now the banners read as tissue threads washed into memory, the images on them indistinct, as if someone had breathed on an old painting until its lines blurred. Mei Lin had learned to read this soft erasure as if it were weather. Her studio was a narrow room tucked behind chambers that smelled of sandalwood and old dust. Pigeons nested in the eaves beyond its latticed window. In the morning they sounded like a string of small bells muffled by wool. There were brushes in cups that had once belonged to ancestresses. There were jars labeled with inked characters only she knew, names of stones and names of places. Mnemonic marks left by women who had kept recipes they could not give to men. The light that fell into the room was thin as silk, but Mei Lin had eyes trained to strip a color of its sadness and ask what lay beneath. When Eunuch Rong had come for her, shuttled with the peculiar hush reserved for those who move within the inner court, she had folded her hands without flinching. He had spoken only a line at the doorway, and it had been enough. The emperor will see the scroll at the morning rite. Prepare your paper. There had been a dozen reasons to refuse, the scalded memory of politics, the names whispered in the market of painters who had been denounced, the knowledge that pigments could be counted and their traces belied. Yet in Mei Lin's chest a small, stubborn thing shook. It was not fear that drove her to the work that morning, but a kind of duty like those old women who kept votive tiles safe from the rain. If color touched a mind, if a hue could open a gate inside a man who had been losing himself, then the work of women, like her, would matter in a way neither the ministers nor the generals could measure. She wrapped the illegal fragment in a scrap of silk and pinned it inside her sleeve before she left. The fragment was a smear on a rag torn from a southern atelier, flaked, almost nothing. But when she had let it wet in water that tasted of salt, she had seen something bloom, a blue that sang low, like a conch rubbed by a practiced hand. The southern blue came from wars that smelled of the sea and of old storms. It obliged the hand to be gentle and to remember the patience of tides. The ceremonial hall smelled faintly of incense and of oil gone rancid from years of neglect. The emperor came late, walking with the carefulness of someone who feared the wrong step would displace more than his body. He moved as if through a cloud, reaching for facts the way a man reaches for a handrail in a dark stairwell. His attendants flanked him in muted grey. Their faces were pale as porcelain dolls. Mei Lin watched him from the side, where artists were permitted as long as they were invisible, and felt a tug she could not name. She had painted for emperors before, images of dragons and lotus, fans threaded with sparrows and river reeds. It was different to paint and hold in one's hands the possibility of a man remembering. She folded that possibility into the palm of her hand and smoothed it like a wet scroll. The scroll she had been asked to paint was for a routine commemorative rite and